Okay, halfway through the show right now, we're going to go on to our second album of the 70s. This is going to be Jeff Beck, Blow by Blow. We have not covered Jeff Beck either by himself or in any of his band forms. And I think that we did touch on him briefly earlier this year because unfortunately Jeff Beck did pass away on January 10th of this year. Born in 1944, passed away this year, so that would put him, let's see, I'm just doing my quick math right now. 04, 14, 24 would have been his 70th birthday, so 69 years old.
Oh,
So
78.
or 78, I'm sorry. Whoa, my math was really wrong there. 78. Okay, good. It's good to have somebody who, is over the age of 60. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
still relatively young in this day and age, but it is a little bit of a longer narrative. It was getting a little bit depressing, unfortunately, there in some of our earlier tracks. So let's do a little bit of a bio on Jeff Beck. Once again, an extremely hard bio to do because he had about 5 different careers, I'd say. But let me try my best to thumbnail sketch it right here. He spent some time early in his life at London's Wimbledon Art College, and he eventually ends up getting a pretty good gig. Josh, it becomes the Yardbirds' lead guitarist. That's the good part about
Super
it.
group, if there ever was one.
The bad part of it is that he gets one of the harder job assignments ever, which is like, you're going to be the lead guitarist after Eric Clapton. So, and it's a testament to Jeff Beck that like he actually is kind of able to live up to that because boy, that's a daunting assignment right there. He stays with the Yardbirds for a couple of years and he leaves in late 1966. And actually, it's mentioned quite a bit that he kind of thought he was going to be retiring from music. Interestingly enough, the story seems to go that he came back with a track called Love is Blue, a single. They said it's kind of like they said he played it poorly because he hated the song, but he's just kind of floating around. And then he forms the Jeff Beck group. So boy, that didn't last very long, the whole going away, right? Late 66, he says he's retiring. And then later in 67, he forms the Jeff Beck group. And the Jeff Beck group becomes pretty important because they've got some pretty big members in the Jeff Beck group. They've got a vocalist you probably have heard of, Rod Stewart. They've got a bassist you probably heard of, Ron Wood. And then the other member is drummer Ainsley Dunbar. So, and he gets replaced quickly by Mickey Waller. They also are joined later by another part, a guy I think you also may be familiar with, Josh, keyboardist Nicky Hopkins, who is
he's back.
Yeah, a potential CTS Season 1 Hall of Famer who comes back. We are back in basically the same area that Season 1 and early Season 2 is covering. So welcome back, Nicky Hopkins. And the Jeff Beck group plays a lot. A lot of people sort of say they're an early template for heavy metal. I listened. I can hear what they're saying a little bit, but it won't sound like metal for people that are metalheads. But I get
Black Sabbath.
It's like it's like proto, right? Yeah. Like couple past generations of proto for that one. But neither of the albums are successful, unfortunately. The band members didn't get along too, which was another thing. They fight all the time, and they eventually, Stewart and Wood leave to form the Faces, another group we've talked about but haven't covered, and then Jeff Beck breaks up the group. So he then looks to try to form a power trio. He wanted to form it with Vanilla Fudge members Carmine Appice and Tim Bogert, but he gets in a car accident in 1970. And it takes him until 71 to recover, and both of those members had moved on to play in a band called Cactus. So he makes Jeff Beck Group version number 2 with a couple different members, and the band records 2 albums, Rough and Ready and the Jeff Beck Group, but neither album attracts much attention. And finally, Jeff Beck gets his power trio because Cactus dissolves in late 1972, and then Beck brings them in, and they're a power trio finally. They do a studio album that is only released in Japan, doesn't get released in either the US or UK, and critics pretty much hate it. And so Beck is kind of floating around doing nothing, or I shouldn't say nothing, but kind of in obscurity. Maybe obscurities. Well, kind of in flux, maybe is a better way to describe it. And then he reemerges about 18 months after the end of that power trio with this album, Blow by Blow, produced by the one and only George Martin.
Of the
And
Beatles.
you
Yeah,
got
George
it.
Martin.
Yep. And he collaborates with Jan Hammer on this. Do you know where you would know Jan Hammer from,
Oh,
Josh?
believe it's Jan Hammer, right?
Jan Hammer. I'm sorry. Yes, apologize.
He's
Do you know where you Jan
Rolling
Hammer? Yeah.
Stone, right?
No, no,
Oh.
no.
Okay.
1980s. The Miami Vice theme song, my man.
Oh,
I
right.
recognize. I may not have got the first name right, but I knew the song immediately when I saw the name.
Oh, Jan
So,
Wenner is the Rolling
Jan
Stone.
Wenner
I
is
think.
Rolling Stones. Yes, yeah, not Jan Hammer.
Not Jan
That's,
de Bont either.
who's the
There's
Miami?
another-
Yes. So and then they go on tour. The tour is documented on a live album called Jeff Beck with the Jan Hammer Group Live, and then Jeff Beck retires again. Of course, he doesn't, because he comes back in the 80s, and he basically continues to play off and on for the rest of his life. He actually does a joint tour with Brian Wilson all the way in 2013, which would have been an interesting listen.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he does a lot of different stuff. He's kind of all over the place. He's playing lead guitar on Roger Waters' comeback album in 1992. He's dropping his own solo albums. He's playing with Stevie Ray Vaughan on I mean, he's all over the place. You know what I mean? And kind of different stuff like that. He also becomes very good friends with Johnny Depp, and they decide that they're going to try to record an album together. And they delivered an album called 18 in June of 2022, which was interesting. It's about 6 months before his death. That album comes out. So his last piece of artistic work was with Johnny Depp, interestingly enough.
Well, he's always up there with like best guitarist, right? So he could. I
Yes.
feel like he's always like slotted in or guest playing on whoever needed him. It sounds like.
Yep. And, he is known for having an eclectic career that zigs and zags along the way. This album apparently represents quite a deviation from what he ever did before. I say that only because this is our first go around with Jeff Beck, so we're going to talk about this album. But I guess it's safe to say that when we talk about this, we shouldn't mention this as Jeff Beck staples, right? Because this is a big departure from what he normally sounds like, which is more rock oriented.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So straight ahead, like I guess what we'd call classic rock. So I want to start by saying that's something there. So, okay, let's go ahead and talk about this album. Go ahead, Josh, tell me what you thought.
Yeah, so not knowing what Jeff Beck sounds like outside of kind of classic rock notions, this is very different. It's feels very free form. It's an instrumental album, we should say, and I guess I'd classify as like a jam album, jam rock, or something like that in terms of how it sounds. It's very of the 70s too in its sound. I guess it's also would be considered like jazz rock in terms of its
interesting
fluidity.
You say that it's of, yes, Jeff, it's interesting you say of the 70s though. I'll counter that a little in my review.
Okay. I guess the closest equivalent that it reminded me of is like Peter Frampton when we talked about him and kind of that sound. There's some electronic distortion or kind of using, I don't know, pickups or whatever the things you click on the ground to change the sound of your guitar. I feel like those are in effect here a lot. There's a very I think it's indebted to funk in some ways as well. That opening track, You Know What I Mean, is very funky. He has there's a lot of keyboards in here as well, and there's a lot of I don't know, there's interesting title tracks or interesting track titles as well. There's one called Constipated Duck, which is interesting. The track Scatterbrain, which is probably a standout on this one, does kind of sound scatterbrained. There's a lot of quick switching of like chords and sounds. It's not scatterbrained in terms of like it's chaotic. It feels very like intentional of how it's constructed, but it does evoke a kind of scatterbrained, frenetic feeling to it. Also, I like that track too because you think it's over, but then it goes to like this higher higher range and ending that's interesting. It's also of its sound because Stevie Wonder makes an appearance on this, and the clavinet is a big instrument that appears as well. And I feel like that is the clavinet is such a hallmark of the 70s for me. And I think as we talked about the clavinet a lot in the 70s, but I feel like it's an instrument that has fallen out of favor, and just due to the way it sounds, or it's in my mind is kind of square now as well. If we're gonna evoke that word, I don't know. It's got this. It's an interesting album. It's got a lot of different. Every track is kind of going for something different. In some ways, there's a track called Thelonious that seems more, it's probably in reference to Thelonious Monk, but has a more jazz sound. It's got I would describe it as a fat sound to it. And, but then he also isn't afraid to add some orchestration to the final track, Diamond Dust, has strings on it, and has almost like a melodramatic score to a movie. In that track, so he's really kind of exploring the space, I think, and it's not a lot of rocking guitar like you might think of, or if you know the Yardbirds or kind of 60s rock in that way. It's more experimental, I would say. It's more really jam band sounds, like it's a precursor to other jam bands that would appear later in a lot of ways. And it's got, I wouldn't say it's got a chill vibe, this album, but it's got a more I don't know, drug induced like you might enjoy this album under the influence more. It's really like hippie-ish in a way too, Grateful Dead maybe inspired, but yeah, those are the kind of initial things that came to mind listening to it.
Yeah, my initial notes were, this sounds like one of the better jam band albums
Yeah.
I've ever heard. It's part jazz fusion for sure. It sounds like jazz rock. Like there's that element of it. It's interesting in that it's got, like you mentioned, the clavinet. It's got a little bit of the Stevie Wonder in the 70s vibe to it as well, which is really interesting. And synthesizers, which I don't think you meant. There's synthesizers all over this album, which I was not expecting at all on this album. There is a little bit of funk, especially in the bass, I'd say. And yeah, and jam bands for sure. But I am not usually a big fan of jam bands, but I connected with this album quite a bit. I thought it was a really interesting listen. And some of it was because it kind of became like a soundscape for me in a way where a lot of these guitar instrumental albums just have no soul to me. It's kind of my argument about prog rock sometimes, that it's a soulless pursuit. It's like, yeah, you're playing virtuoso or really strong stuff, but there just is no emotional resonance to it. Like this one, I felt more emotional resonance to it. I did not get a drug vibe. Certainly, could you take drugs with this, or it'd be yes, but I don't think you needed to, because I don't, right? And I kind of I process this much more like a jazz album, I'd say, where there's all of these different chord changes and instrumental parts. There's cooling down periods, right? And then there's frantic periods. And he's a hell of a guitar player. And I think to some degree, you heard that a lot of the albums suffered earlier because the vocals were not as strong. I think this was one where he's just sort of like, I'm going to kind of do my thing. Another Beatles cover. We've had a lot of them this week. We've got a Beatles cover, and She's a Woman on this one. Thelonious definitely, with the jazz fusion sound on this, is a throwback to Thelonious Monk. The big takeaway for me is I really liked Air Blower and Scatterbrain back to back. In the middle of the album, it was just such a nice touch point. I liked it the first time I heard it, and the second time I heard it, it really, really connected with me. And I would go so far as to say that this is in a genre that I don't normally like, which is sort of free-form instrumental jam rock, right? This one I thought was the higher form of the art right now. It was not at all what I expected. I expected to hear a guitar-heavy classic rock album,
Yeah,
right?
that's kind
Like,
of what I was expecting.
yeah, blues-based guitar driving rock, which I think is what we would have got if we heard it before this. But it's clear that he was going in a different direction, and I was digging it. The fact that he was pulling all of these things together as opposed to just staying in one lane was such an attribute, because I think if he had just tried to do Stevie Wonder or just tried to do virtuoso stuff, or just tried to jam out with no other elements and just wailed away with a bass line sort of
Yeah.
just running steadily, I think all of those would have been not as appealing to me. But sort of taking all these different sounds and then putting it in the same sort of chaotic's the wrong in sort of the same creative environment that the jazz fusion stuff in the
Yep.
mid to late 60s and early 70s was in, which I liked. It worked for me, so this one gets a thumbs up for me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, you're higher on this album than me. I think the jazz fusion is a barrier. It's hard for me to get into it. I feel like one or the other is kind of my preferred mode, and I appreciate the kind of experimentation and the virtuosity on this album, but the sound of the music didn't like strike me as something that struck. It didn't strike a chord with me as you said it did with you. And the clavinet, I'm finding, is not only is it place it firmly in the 70s, it's just not the sound. I don't like the sound of the clavinet that much.
Yeah.
So I also see here that Stevie Wonder actually is uncredited clavinet on Thelonious, so he played on this album technically. And
Well, that song and "Cause We've Ended as Lovers" are both Stevie Wonder songs.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so that makes sense. And then I don't know, I wish well, I can't say that I wish there was more guitar, but there's a lot of guitar on it. I don't know, I think I just
Yeah, I don't know if you can get much more guitar than this. Yeah.
it's just the jazz, ultimately the jazz fusion sound and the kind of jam band nature of this album are not two different things that I do not really is a hard thing for me to grasp onto and enjoy. So I appreciated certain parts of it, like I mentioned, Scatterbrained and Thelonious, but I don't know, the She's a Woman, it's definitely different sounding than the Beatles, but I don't feel like it really stood out as a really great cover that I want to listen to again. So I don't know, I'm kind of like a thumbs in the middle on this one.
Okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
Well, I could tell you who almost certainly would be a thumbs up on this one when we talk to him. It's going to be our friend Matt. Yes.
Yes.
I think he is going to also be. I don't know how familiar he is with Jeff Beck, but I know he's been listening to our shows and giving a little
really?
bit of
Okay.
feedback here and there. So I don't want to give too much, but I'll direct him to this one to hear his take, because I think this one might, even more so than it did for me, fall into his sweet spot in terms of what he likes. And he always struggled a little bit with the pure jazz fusion, but I wonder if the tweaks here, right, kind of get him over the hump. So it would be an interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think if I had to guess, I think he's really into this album.
Yep. So, okay. So a little bit, first time this week, we have a little bit of a difference of opinion right there in terms of album.